Today, the world woke up to a headline that looks like a scene from a thriller. Denmark panic. 45,000 U.S. Rangers and elite Arctic paratroopers arrive in Greenland. But beneath the sensational words lies something far more dangerous. A shifting geopolitical reality, a frozen frontier suddenly alive with military might, and a crisis that could redraw the map of global power. Greenland, the world's largest island, has always been strategically important but quietly forgotten by most of the world. Its vast ice sheets hide ancient secrets, rich mineral reserves, and control over emerging Arctic sea routes that could revolutionize international trade. As the Arctic ice melts, those routes are waking up, and with them, the interest of mighty nations. A figure like 45,000 elite soldiers arriving in Greenland sounds staggering and, in the world of headlines, impossible to ignore. Imagine it, battalions of U.S. Army Rangers trained for every climate, airborne paratroopers seasoned for Arctic warfare, elite units disembarking onto frozen tundra as strategic bombers roar overhead. But is it real, or is it the opening scene of a new global crisis? To understand what's really happening beneath this explosive title, we must look closer at history, at tensions, and at motives. Greenland's modern military story didn't begin with giants landing from the sky. It began decades ago when the U.S. and Denmark signed a defense pact that allowed the United States to operate military facilities on the island during the Cold War. One of those sites, Pituis Space Base, remains a quiet sentinel in the high Arctic, a symbol of strategic importance that has outlasted the Soviet Union, nuclear stalemate, and multiple eras of tension. Yet in recent months, that quiet has fractured. Renewed interest from the United States, partly driven by concerns over Russian and Chinese Arctic influence, has turned Greenland's future into a diplomatic flashpoint. High-level talks between U.S., Danish, and Greenlandic officials have begun, aimed to easing tensions after controversial statements about U.S. ambitions for the island's security role. In response, several European NATO countries have moved personnel to Greenland, not tens of thousands, but enough to fuel headlines, as reconnaissance teams and symbolic support missions. Germany, France, Sweden, and Norway announced deployments intended to explore security options and signal solidarity with Danish sovereignty. That movement, though much smaller in scale than tens of thousands of troops, is still historic. Soldiers accustomed to icy conditions began arriving in Nuuk, lending weight to a silent game of strategic chess. And while Denmark and its allies insist their activities are exercises and preparations for Arctic defense, the optics of increased armed forces on Greenlandic soil are impossible to dismiss. Denmark itself is no passive observer in this story. The Danish Defense Ministry has announced plans to strengthen its own military presence on the island, in cooperation with its NATO partners, citing the need to secure the Arctic as global competition rises. In the Arctic, preparation is everything. Unlike tropical or temperate climates, Arctic warfare is unforgiving. Temperatures can plunge below -50 degrees Celsius. Storms can blow visibility to zero. Navigation is treacherous. Every move must be deliberate, every supply line secure. Any deployment, whether 500 soldiers or 50,000, is a statement that conditions, geography, and strategy have been mastered. But headlines like this one feed fear because they suggest something else entirely, not just preparation, but intent. Intent to seize, to dominate, to alter the status quo by force. And that is where panic begins. Across Copenhagen and Nuuk, discussions are no longer theoretical. Politicians, military planners, and local leaders are grappling with both the reality and the possibility of a massive U.S. force, even if that number is exaggerated. Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland is not just a matter of defense policy, it is a deeply political issue tied to identity, self-determination, and regional autonomy. The Greenlandic people have long debated their future, with full independence a goal long in discussion. Any perception of armed foreign troops arriving in mass triggers not just military concerns, but existential ones. What happens when the world's most powerful military begins to operate near your home? What does it mean if elite airborne units trained for rapid assault are reported to be landing on your frozen coast? And what happens when diplomacy intertwines with speculation, social media exaggeration, and fear of the unknown? The answer is complicated, because in geopolitics, perception often matters as much as reality. Already, articles, videos, and social media posts amplify fear. Screenshots of supposed troop movements, claims of massive arrivals, and speculative maps of military zones spread faster than verified facts. Some content creators point to elite units like U.S. Rangers or Arctic-trained paratroopers, echoing fears about a possible takeover or military confrontation. But careful analysis shows that no credible sources confirm a 45,000-troop landing in Greenland at this time. Instead, what we see is profound strategic repositioning, not invasion. Diplomacy is active, high-level discussions are ongoing, NATO allies are visibly engaging in Arctic reconnaissance, Denmark is reinforcing its own forces, and yet no official has declared full-scale military action. Here lies the heart of the panic: uncertainty. Uncertainty about intentions, uncertainty about future deployments, uncertainty about how Russia, China, and other Arctic stakeholders will respond, and uncertainty whether Greenland, a land of ice, ancient culture, and fragile ecosystems, will become the stage for a new chapter in global power politics. For now, the world watches and waits, because in modern conflict, silence can be louder than explosions. Once the idea spreads that tens of thousands of elite U.S. troops could arrive in Greenland, even as speculation, it forces decision-makers to act. Denmark cannot afford to ignore it, NATO cannot pretend it doesn't matter, and rival powers certainly won't sit quietly and wait for clarity. In the Arctic, perception becomes pressure, and pressure demands response. The first real danger wouldn't be an invasion, it would be acceleration. Emergency meetings would multiply across European capitals. Danish defense planners would reassess every agreement, every base, every airstrip. Greenlandic leaders would be pulled into intense negotiations, caught between strategic necessity and public concern. Questions would dominate every room. How much U.S. presence is too much? Where does cooperation end and control begin? And who decides? At the same time, military systems don't wait for political consensus. Surveillance flights would increase, satellites would reposition, submarines would move silently beneath the Arctic ice, not to attack, but to watch, to listen, to ensure that if something changes, no one is surprised. The Arctic would begin to feel crowded, even though it remains vast and empty. This is how escalation hides, in preparation. If elite Arctic paratroopers were truly deployed, their role would not be symbolic. These units are designed for rapid seizure of terrain, securing key infrastructure, and operating in extreme environments where conventional forces struggle. Airfields, radar sites, communication hubs. In a crisis, these locations matter more than cities.
And Greenland has many of them. From early warning systems to space tracking installations, Greenland plays a quiet but essential role in global security architecture. Any perception that these assets could be influenced, controlled, or contested instantly raises alarms far beyond Denmark. The United States knows this, so does every major power watching the Arctic. This is where the story stops being regional. Russia has invested heavily in Arctic militarization, reopening bases and expanding patrols along its northern coast. China, while geographically distant, has declared itself an Arctic stakeholder, pouring resources into research and infrastructure. Neither would ignore a sudden shift in Greenland's military balance. Reactions wouldn't come as threats, they would come as movement. More patrols, more exercises, more defensive deployments, each justified as precaution, each increasing the density of forces in a region never designed for this level of activity. And when multiple powers operate close together, mistakes become inevitable. A navigation error, a misinterpreted radar signal, an aircraft flying too close to restricted airspace. None of these start wars on their own, but they test restraint. For Denmark, the nightmare scenario isn't occupation, it's loss of control, being forced to react instead of lead, being caught between alliance obligations and domestic pressure. Greenland's population is small, but its political weight is enormous. Any perception that decisions are being made over their heads could ignite protests, political instability, and long-term damage to trust. And trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. This is why Denmark's panic, real or perceived, matters so much. Panic accelerates timelines. It pushes leaders toward visible action, statements, deployments, restrictions that may calm the public but alarm others. And every action invites interpretation. Is Denmark resisting? Is Denmark cooperating? Is Greenland becoming militarized beyond its consent? In a world driven by instant media, these questions don't wait for answers. Social platforms would amplify rumors, unverified troop numbers would circulate, old images would be recycled as proof. Each post would raise the temperature, each reaction would demand response. Reality would struggle to keep up with narrative, and narratives can be dangerous. At the military level, the greatest risk would be normalization. If heightened presence becomes routine, vigilance fades. Systems stay armed longer. Crews rotate under stress, fatigue sets in. History shows that long standoffs end not with intention, but with accidents. A collision at sea, a misfire during an exercise, a cyber operation that spills beyond its target. At that point, de-escalation becomes politically costly. No leader wants to explain why they backed down. No military wants to admit error under pressure. And so, each side tightens posture just a little more, raises readiness just a little higher, moves one step closer to the line they promise not to cross. This is how frozen regions heat up. Yet even now, another outcome remains possible. The panic could force clarity. Diplomatic channels could strengthen, agreements could be reaffirmed, limits on troop presence could be negotiated, transparency measures could cool speculation. Greenland's leadership could assert clearer authority over security arrangements. The noise could settle, slowly, imperfectly, but enough to avoid disaster. This is the hope behind restraint. Because no one truly wants the Arctic to become the next permanent front line. The cost is too high, the environment too fragile, the consequences too global. Even the most powerful militaries understand that some regions, once militarized, never return to neutrality. Greenland stands at that edge. Right now, the story is not about 45,000 troops. It's about what the world believes could happen and how it reacts to that belief. Panic doesn't require facts, it requires uncertainty, and uncertainty is everywhere. The ice remains silent, the skies remain clear, no boots march openly across the tundra. But beneath the calm, calculations continue, because in geopolitics, the most dangerous moment is not when troops arrive, it's when everyone starts preparing for the possibility that they might. And that preparation, once begun, changes everything.